Good morning. Today's hearing of the Congressional Executive Commission on China's zero COVID policy and authoritarian public health control will come to order. Before we turn to the subject of this hearing, I'd like to announce that the Commission will publish our annual report on human rights conditions and rule of law developments in China. So we will be publishing that tomorrow. And this report once again marks the culmination of a year of work by the Commission's nonpartisan research staff to produce an extraordinarily detailed, comprehensive, and credible account of the situation in China. There's a huge thanks to the staff of the Commission for really incredible work. The annual report outlines the systemic and often brutal efforts by the government of the People's Republic of China to censor, torture, and detain ethnic and religious minorities, critics of Chinese Communist Party policy, and advocates of basic rights. This past year, transnational repression has been a particular concern for this commission, and the report details the tools used by Chinese authorities to reach into other countries to silence critics, to enhance control over diaspora communities, to conduct surveillance, and to force the repatriation of their targets. Within China, the report documents evidence that top leaders directed the genocide in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, including policies of forced labor, sexual violence, and family separation. This year's reporting also shines a spotlight on the pervasive problem of violence against women, with high-profile cases showing the vulnerability of women across society. Meanwhile, coercive population control policies directed to ethnic minority populations amount to eugenics, while the broader policies continue to intrude on families' decisions about if, when, and how to have children. Both at home and abroad, General Secretary Xi Jinping seeks to promote what he calls, quote, a Chinese view of human rights. This report punctures that narrative. People in China and the diaspora communities around the world deserve the same fundamental human rights as everyone else. The 2022 annual report reflects the view of our commissioners that the human rights abuses the report details require a whole government response by the United States and coordinated action with other countries. In partnership with our newly appointed executive branch commissioners, which we are so delighted to have, I look forward to continuing to work across our government to advance the recommendations in the report so we can protect those fleeing persecution, those facing transnational repression, those fighting coercion, those fearing the destruction of their culture. The annual report shows how the Chinese Communist Party seeks to dominate daily life to control how citizens live. Nowhere has the intensity of this political and social control been more apparent over the last year than in the implementation of the draconian zero COVID policy. As senior leaders stake the credibility of the Chinese Communist Party on this policy, authorities implemented disproportionately harsh public security measures, often using coercive quarantine controls that infringed on privacy rights, freedom of movement, freedom of expression, and due process. At the height of the Shanghai lockdown this spring, there were an estimated 373 million people under lockdown throughout China. To enforce these lockdowns, authorities often tape up entrances and erect fences to prevent residents from leaving their homes. They sweep up residents of entire buildings for mandatory quarantine in makeshift facilities. They marshal the full power of the surveillance state to monitor and often control people's movements and health. They aggressively censor and detain critics of the policy, and they leave vulnerable populations unable to access medical care for other conditions. As we will hear this morning, China's zero COVID policy comes at great cost to fundamental rights and may be unsustainable or even counterproductive in protecting overall public health. Leading experts in public health, information suppression, and Chinese political leadership dynamics will help us better understand this policy, what it has meant for the people of China, and where it may go from here. The testimony we'll hear recognizes that these policies have resulted in some protection of the population from the ravages of the virus the world has grappled with for nearly 3 years. Every country has wrestled with how best to protect public health from COVID-19, and there are no easy answers. But we'll have an obligation, we all have an obligation, to protect basic rights, and this hearing will help us understand a policy so central to what it means to live in China today. I'll now recognize Congressman McGovern for opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for convening this hearing on China's zero COVID policy and its implication for human rights. I join the chair in welcoming the announcement that the Commission's 2022 annual report will be published tomorrow. I encourage everyone to read it on our website. It is once again a well-organized and well-sourced accounting of the Chinese government's failures to meet its obligations under international human rights law. The report is the product of countless hours of diligent work by our research staff. I cannot praise them enough for their hard work on this report, and I cannot thank them enough for the effort they made to produce this excellent resource. In addition to the tragedy of the 6.6 million deaths caused by the coronavirus globally, the pandemic has put strain on societies and communities everywhere. Each of us has had to change our behavior for the good of ourselves, our neighbors, and our colleagues. The pandemic also creates challenges for human rights. The COVID-19 guidance issued by the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights acknowledges that emergency measures that may restrict human rights should be proportionate to the evaluated risk necessary and applied in a non-discriminatory way, including having a specific focus and duration and taking the least intrusive approach possible to protect public health. It also asserts that respect for human rights across the spectrum, including economic, social, cultural, and civil and political rights, will be fundamental to the success of the public health response and recovery from the pandemic. Through this lens, we are here to assess China's record. We have seen the videos of personnel in hazmat suits spraying disinfectant public spaces, and of crowds rushing out of factories or amusement parks to avoid being locked down. We saw the images of the anti-Xi banner over the bridge in Beijing and of lockdown protests in Lhasa. But there are thousands, if not millions, of stories of hardship and dissent that we do not hear, in part because of the Chinese government's censorship. We welcome our expert witnesses to help us understand the experiences of people in China under the zero COVID policy. And we must know the names of the people who have suffered for reporting or speaking out about the government's policies. These include Zhang Zan and Fang Bin, citizen journalists detained in early 2020 in connection with their efforts to document the COVID-19 outbreak in Wuhan. Xu Zhaiyang, a civil society advocate arrested and tried for criticizing Xi Jinping's handling of the pandemic, and Xu Zhengrun, a professor who was fired and had his pension suspended for writing about the failures of the government's response. Lastly, I note that the Chinese government's zero COVID policy has created food shortages. OHCHR's COVID-19 guidance notes that the pandemic has exacerbated food insecurity and urges governments to take urgent steps to meet the population's dietary needs. We have seen evidence that the lockdowns and draconian restrictions have limited access to food. The banner on the Beijing bridge read in part, "We want to eat." China is a state party to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which means it formally recognizes the fundamental human right to be free of hunger. The Chinese government is obligated as a matter of human rights to ensure that its pandemic response does not punish people into food insecurity. Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to gaining a greater understanding of the situation from our witnesses, as well as recommendations for how the United States should respond.
Thank you very much, Congressman McGovern. And Congressman Smith, are you with us, and did you want to make opening remarks? Okay, he is not on, so we're going to go ahead, and I'm going to introduce our panel. Yanzhong Huang is a senior fellow for global health at the Council on Foreign Relations and a professor and director of global health studies at Seton Hall University School of Diplomacy and International Relations. He is the founding editor of Global Health Governance, the scholarly journal for the new health security paradigm, and has written extensively on the COVID-19 pandemic and Chinese public health developments of the last 20 years. Sarah Cook is Research Director for China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan at Freedom House. She has published multiple reports on China's media influence operations and directs the China Media Bulletin, a monthly digest in English and in Chinese on media freedom developments in China. She managed and wrote sections for Freedom House's recent report titled Beijing's Global Media Influence, Authoritarian Expansion, and the Power of Democratic Resilience. Rory Truex is an assistant professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University. His research focuses on Chinese politics and authoritarian systems. His current projects explore how Chinese citizens evaluate their political system, the relationship between media bias and credibility in non-democracies, and patterns in dissident behavior and punishment. In 2021, he received the President's Award for Distinguished Teaching, the highest teaching honor at Princeton. Thank you all for joining us for this hearing. And without objection, your full written statements will be entered into the record. And we ask that you keep your oral remarks to about 5 minutes. And we'll start with Dr. Huang.
Well, thank you, Senator Merkley, Congressman McGowan, and members of the commission. I'm honored to be invited to testify at this hearing on China's zero COVID policy and authoritarian public health control. In the written testimony, I made the 3 arguments on the human rights dilemmas of zero COVID in China. The first is that zero COVID, despite that the seemingly chaotic pursuit of a COVID-free society, it indeed shields most of the population from the virus. With nearly 20% of the world's population, China has recorded only 1.1 million cases. That accounts for 1.1% of the total COVID cases worldwide. And it registered about 5,000 COVID deaths. That is only actually less than 0.5% of the US mortality level. So that extremely low levels of infection and mortality appeal to evince the government's people first and life first approach in COVID prevention and control. But of course, this leads to my second point, China's ability to slow the virus is achieved to the detriment of human rights and the civil liberties. I believe Sarah and Rory are going to testify on that, so I'm not going to repeat what I said in the written testimony. I want to highlight the third point, that is how zero COVID compromises people's health and well-being. This prolonged and stringent implementation of zero COVID nationwide has essentially created other second-order problems, especially by those lockdown measures impede access to food, healthcare, and other basic necessities. There's studies suggesting the significant decline of the utilization of healthcare services after lockdown measures were introduced in the country. And in cities under prolonged lockdowns, such as Xi'an, Shanghai, Jilin, and Urumqi, residents also face shortages of food and other basic necessities. By shielding the population from COVID-19, zero COVID also has the unintended effect of sustaining the immunity gap between China and the rest of the world. We found, and according to the government data, no more than a small fraction of 1% of the Chinese population acquired some level of natural immunity due to prior infection. And this places China in a unique situation of having only vaccine-induced immunity. And because of the low efficacy rate of the Chinese vaccines, of course, the antibodies generated by these vaccines have dropped to a level that is considered very low or even undetectable now. So, that immunity gap significantly increased the risk of the healthcare system being overwhelmed by a rapid surge of cases. Should policy relaxation occur, that paradoxically justifies the persistence of the zero COVID policy regime. And in the meantime, the single-minded pursuit of COVID prevention control also means that other major public health challenges receive less attention that very likely increase the overall disease burden in China. It is clear that the prolonged and stringent school closures and stay-at-home orders in combination with the fear about COVID-19 have aggravated a mental health crisis in the country. In addition, by discouraging and even denying people from accessing food, medicine, and care for other illnesses, the policy is expected to contribute to a growing non-communicable disease burden, including diabetes, heart attack, stroke, and cancer, which are the leading killers in the country. According to the Dean of the School of Social Sciences at Tsinghua University, diabetes deaths have increased by 80% in the country. He also suggested that the harm to health caused by COVID-19 has been overshadowed by the second-order disasters associated with the stringent COVID control measures in China. So to quickly wrap up, I think this testimony, I want to acknowledge these huge efforts and achievements of China in shielding its 1.4 billion people from COVID-19 and the widespread encroachment on privacy and civil liberties in the country. In the meantime, it also suggested that the proclaimed people first and life first approach in combating COVID-19 should be evaluated in light of the lack of commitment to addressing other major public health challenges in the country. So move away from zero COVID is the only wise approach to transcend this human rights dilemma. And for the sake of time, I know you will ask questions about policy recommendations. I will leave that due to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And now we're going to turn to Ms. Cook.
Thank you very much, Senator Merkley, Congressman McGovern, and other members of the Commission. I'm really honored to be able to speak here today. Nearly 3 years after the virus known as COVID-19 first appeared in Wuhan, as we just heard, the Chinese government is continuing large-scale lockdowns to try and contain and spread. But these lockdowns are also occurring in a country that is home to the most sophisticated and multi-layered apparatus of information control in the world. In my time today, I'd like to share analysis on how these two dimensions of life in China, the government's zero COVID policy and its information control system, are intersecting. For one thing, Chinese officials have gone to great lengths to restrict the information available to the Chinese public and the international community about the conditions in lockdown areas. Traditional media and investigative reporting have been censored, such as an article by Caixin, a widely respected business publication about hidden deaths at Shanghai's largest nursing home. On social media, China-based tech platforms have censored videos, posts, and articles related to lockdowns and problems like food shortages, including simple search terms like buying vegetables in Shanghai. One heartbreaking target for censorship have been accounts of non-COVID lockdown deaths. Examples of seemingly preventable deaths due to lockdown measures rather than the disease itself include late-term miscarriages, a pregnant woman denied hospital entry, a 3-year-old boy dying from carbon monoxide poisoning, and a bus crash en route to a centralized quarantine center. These cases have been posted online and sparked public outcries, but were then censored themselves. Posts about COVID-19 lockdowns in ethnic minority regions like Xinjiang and Tibet, where reports of starvation have emerged, have been subject to censorship and other forms of manipulation. Directives were issued to, quote, internet commentary personnel in early September to engage in content flooding efforts on Weibo, aimed at drowning out posts about the lockdown in Xinjiang with lifestyle and cooking posts, while the platform deprioritized hashtags on Tibet. And of course, the Chinese security services have also detained and prosecuted outspoken citizens. In September, Xinjiang police reportedly detained 4 Han Chinese internet users accused of, quote, spreading rumors, and over 600 residents who defied lockdown orders to protest the lack of food. Long-term democracy advocate Guo Chuan was tried last September for inciting subversion after he published articles criticizing the government's response to the pandemic. And in January, citizen journalist and Falun Gong practitioner Xu Na was sentenced to 8 years in prison for sending photos about restrictions in Beijing to an overseas Chinese language website, one of the longest known sentences to date for sharing COVID-19 related information. The extended lockdowns in Shanghai and other cities have prompted more experts within China, including top medical professionals, law professors, and financial analysts, to raise objections to the human and economic costs of the government's zero COVID policy, with some calling on their leaders to consider less rigid alternatives. But they too have encountered censorship. Nevertheless, there are cracks in Beijing's information controls. The fact that I'm able to put this testimony together with detailed examples demonstrates that the information the Communist Party would prefer disappeared still circulates inside and outside China, often thanks to ordinary Chinese citizens and at great sacrifice. During the Shanghai lockdown, Chinese users went to extraordinary lengths to circumvent censorship, keep content online, and find avenues for freer expression. Various initiatives have also kept deleted content alive outside the Great Firewall. Resentment related to lockdowns has also translated into real-world protests. A new Freedom House project, the China Dissent Monitor, documented 40 cases of Chinese citizens protesting COVID-19 restrictions since June. They include protests with hundreds of participants, not only in Shanghai, but also in Hebei, Liaoning, and Jiangsu provinces, and online hashtag movements featuring hundreds of thousands of posts. At least some of these outcries have yielded results at the local level, including policy adjustments or official accountability. In 9 of the 40 China Dissent Monitor cases mentioned, some form of concession was documented, such as local officials lifting burdensome travel restrictions on commuters. Looking ahead, however, it remains highly uncertain how much such pressures will trickle up to a nationwide change in policy. All the while, the censorship apparatus evolves and expands. My written testimony includes several recommendations, but to conclude my oral testimony, I just want to reiterate the importance of raising the names of imprisoned free expression activists in meetings with Chinese counterparts, and to recognize 3 of the individuals that Congressman McGovern also mentioned, who are facing perilous legal and health conditions in custody after being jailed for reporting on commentary related to COVID-19. Zhang Jian, a female citizen journalist who's serving a 4-year prison sentence. Fang Bin, a vlogger from the first days of the pandemic in Wuhan. Fang is also a Falun Gong believer and was tortured during previous imprisonment. And Xu Zhiyong, a prominent rights lawyer and democracy advocate who has suffered years of reprisals and abuse due to his activism. He was tried just a few months ago, but his sentence has yet to be announced. All 3 are courageous individuals and symbolic figures for the broader array of Chinese citizens yearning for greater free expression and government accountability. Any lenience shown to them, thanks to international pressure, will have wider-ranging repercussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cook, and thank you for the excellent work of Freedom House in highlighting human rights conditions around the globe. And now we're going to turn to Dr. Truex. Welcome.
Thank you to Chair Merkley and Co-Chair McGovern and members of the Commission for the opportunity to join the discussion today. I also want to thank the members and the staff of the CECC for all their hard work on human rights. I personally have benefited from the political prisoner database. I use that in my own research, and it's been very helpful for our field in understanding the nature of human rights abuses in China today. So I wanted to focus my remarks on sort of the political side of the story and try to understand the main factors that underlie the policy and why dynamic zero COVID has persisted as long as it has. So I would say the first reason has to do with what we would call performance-based legitimacy. And it's important to remember, as Dr. Huang sort of alluded to, that China's COVID story has distinct chapters, and many of them have been very positive, actually, for public perceptions of the CCP. After bungling the initial outbreak in December and January, the Chinese government did manage to bring COVID under control by March. Concurrently, Western governments, and notably the United States, failed to contain the virus and saw widespread casualties. This fact was repeatedly highlighted by the Chinese government. And in that period, China's zero COVID policy was viewed as a resounding success, both at home and abroad. And studies suggest the CCP experienced a tangible boost in regime support during that time. This support might be waning in recent months due to the human cost of zero COVID quarantines and lockdowns, as Ms. Cook alluded to. But is it also important to remember that in general, Chinese citizens seem to support the political system, Other data we have also shows that Chinese citizens appear willing to tolerate intrusions into their personal privacy and civil liberties in the name of preserving social order. So even today, we would be wrong to assume that zero COVID has no support in Chinese society. In fact, the opposite may well be true, as uncomfortable as that is for us. The second key dynamic here is that zero COVID should be understood as a political campaign. This is a style of governance that was more common, of course, in the Mao era, but has seen a resurgence under a different form under Xi Jinping. In a campaign, the core leader announces a vague, ambitious policy goal, and lower-level officials are left to fill in the blanks and implement policies to achieve the goal as best they can. This approach is often problematic as lower-level officials struggle to achieve targets, falsify data, and engage in performance to show their zeal to central leadership. It is also difficult to reverse the course of a campaign, as it is tied personally to the party leader, who would lose stature in the system if the policy were to fail. If I were to say as a political scientist, what is the principal weakness of the Chinese political system, I would say that this is one of them. The ability to change course can be quite constrained. And all of these dynamics are present in China's current zero COVID policy. I would also emphasize that the new CCP leadership lineup announced at the 20th Party Congress privileged Xi loyalists that faithfully implemented zero COVID, namely Li Qiang, who's the party secretary of Shanghai, and Cai Qi, who's the party secretary of Beijing. Li Qiang is now the second-ranked CCP member and is slated to take over the office of premier. This means that the new Politburo Standing Committee is in some sense tainted by the zero COVID policy and will have a strong vested interest in maintaining the perception that it has been a success. Third, and I won't belabor this point because I thought Ms. Cook did an excellent job outlining these dynamics, but it's always important to remember that zero COVID has been a cover to expand political control and has given local governments the justification to collect more and more information on the Chinese population and expand the reach of the surveillance state. Chinese citizens in most areas have a health code tied to their mobile devices, and the ability to move freely in many places is tied to having a green screen indicating a negative test result and no known exposures. Individuals' whereabouts are tracked through their mobile devices, and this information can be used to identify people with COVID exposures through close contact. Public health is thus a cover for the Chinese government to collect and analyze information on people's movements, health, and social networks, and in turn use that information to control their behavior. And we know that certainly under Xi Jinping, political control in China has become addictive. Moving forward, there was initial optimism that China would relax zero COVID after the 20th Party Congress, but instead Xi Jinping appears to have used that moment to defend the policy, seemingly doubling down on the approach. The financial markets are eager for a change of course, and we are seeing rumors coming out of China to this effect. The new measures announced this past Friday suggest a more pragmatic approach to COVID management, but not the elimination of the zero COVID approach itself. And I would say, just from my own perspective, it is best not to underestimate the stickiness of this policy, which could very well be in some form for many months or even years to come. And if it is rolled back, that rollback will likely be very incremental and not abrupt. I will conclude my remarks there. I do have some policy recommendations that I hope I get to raise, but I will end my remarks there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And there's a lot of things to inquire about in all three of your reports. We have with us Lisa Jo Peterson from the executive branch. This is the first time, we believe, in about a decade that we've had a member online from the executive branch. And so, Lisa Jo Peterson, I would like to afford you the opportunity to go first if you would like.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. And my apologies, but I did arrive a few minutes late. So my question may have already been covered. But we are particularly concerned about reports that the zero COVID policy has had a disproportionately negative impact on predominantly minority communities, including in Xinjiang. And so can any of the three speak about ways in which they may have observed the policies being implemented differently across the country? And are there specific groups that you see the PRC treating differently, including Tibetans, who we know were severely impacted by the Lhasa lockdown?
Well, I could talk about this impact of the policy, how it could vary across population groups. But I don't really know much about Xinjiang, but I know that the migrant workers, which we know approximately like close to actually 300 million in China, low-income households, small businesses are particularly hit hard by zero COVID, the lockdown measures. Uh, according to and also by it varies across these groups with different disease. There's a nationwide survey suggesting that 60% of the diabetes patients experienced food or medication shortages during the quarantine period in 2020 in China. We know that China has the world's largest diabetes population. It's like 116 million adults. That is again, this is how this implementation of zero COVID actually exacerbated the problem of inequality. And more recently, the Ministry of Civil Affairs, they have issued a notice to provide one-time funding to those migrant workers who lost their jobs because of the COVID control measures, and the college graduates who have difficulties to find jobs.
I can speak a little bit to some of the minority communities. I think what you see is, some of the same lockdown measures, and I haven't looked specifically at particular announcements, being imposed in Xinjiang and Tibet. I think what happens there, though, is in general, the governance is so much harsher and the incentives are so much stronger, I think, per some of the points that Professor Truex made, to not allow any wiggle room for anything. And so the role of the security state becomes stronger. The tolerance, as brutal as the Chinese security apparatus is throughout China, again, there's just so much more practice and tolerance of harsh measures in these regions, as well as tighter censorship, that I think even if on paper it's the same policy, once it's implemented there, the more systemic disrespect for human rights becomes stronger. And then I think there's also the element of how much more dangerous any form of dissent is there, because there it's just crushed so harshly, any small thing. I think one thing that's interesting is that you do see not only the minority populations in those regions, but also the Han Chinese in those regions being detained for sharing information. And we've seen this in other cases. Han Chinese living in Urumqi writing about things happening in there and then being sentenced to long prison terms. So I think you do see it, affecting a wider range of residents. And then the other thing I would say in terms of other parts of China that I've seen is that, the Falun Gong community is, of course, very severely persecuted throughout China, but they've also set up this underground system of information sharing, often more related to things about their faith, about the persecution of the community. But during COVID, you saw that being mobilized to share information about the state of affairs in lockdown regions. And so then you start to see members of that community being detained and prosecuted, even on different legal charges than they usually get prosecuted on, because it's more related to that freedom of expression and sharing of information, unrelated to, say, the religious community itself. So I would say that's also one thing that you saw. So I'll stop there. I don't know if there's anything that Professor Truex wants to add.
No, I don't have anything to add.
And Secretary Peterson, is there anything else you wanted to inquire about?
I wanted to follow up just a little bit on Professor Truex's comment about the political campaign and see if he could just dig in a little deeper on ways that the PRC is using disinformation and misinformation in this campaign, and using those tools to hinder international journalists or other concerned parties.
I would say, so when we think of a campaign, at least in terms of studying the Chinese political system, we often think about the difficulties of information flow vertically. And so when Xi Jinping is announcing a war on COVID, of course, local level officials are going to be incentivized to suppress data about COVID cases. And so I think we all acknowledge that the number of COVID deaths is underreported. The number of COVID cases is underreported. We don't quite know to what degree. So I think I actually would wonder what Dr. Huang has to say about that. But that's sort of a key dynamic in a campaign, is that people at lower levels in the system feel unwilling or unable to reveal bad information. I would also say that COVID itself has been another form of political cover for the Chinese government to make it difficult for foreigners to go to China. People like myself, I used to go to China every year. I haven't been in 3 years. And so basically the entire foreign academic, student, and journalistic communities are barely going to China at all. And we are trying to make conclusions about this country from Princeton, New Jersey, or New York, or wherever we are. And that has been a major issue. So in my policy recommendations, I do talk a lot about how we can potentially use this moment. We saw Biden and Xi have a meeting yesterday, potentially using this moment as a way to reopen people-to-people exchange. Getting Americans back in China, I think, will be critically important.
Yeah, I have a quick follow-up Professor Truex comments. And I agree with that completely, but this lack of exchange during the COVID era, because of this restriction measures, actually contributing to the misinformation and disinformation efforts. That could happen on both sides. That, in terms of the origin of the virus, of the pandemic, in terms of the severity of the disease. So I would strongly recommend that we reach out to the Chinese side and starting a dialogue on how to reopen this people's to-people exchange and to reduce, eliminate those unnecessary restriction measures.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We are so delighted that Lisa Peterson was able to join us. She's Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, absolutely critical part of the State Department's work, and we're pleased to have you this morning. I'm going to turn to some questions now, and then we'll turn to Congressman McGovern. And I want to start, Dr. Huang, with my understanding of how China is locked into zero COVID. And as I was listening to testimony, I was really hearing that first, there's almost no immunity from people having been sick because the policy has been highly effective and a very low percent of the Chinese population getting COVID, so they don't have natural immunity. Second, that the Chinese vaccines have been very ineffective and have not created much resistance to the disease. So if COVID gets going, it could spread very rapidly in a very devastating fashion. And third, that General Secretary Xi has made this a big point that he's emphasized directly. And so there's a lot of kind of his reputation wrapped up in the success of this. And that all three of those things, both from the scientific side, the possibility of COVID raging very quickly without the immunity or good vaccines, and from the political side, the reputation of the government, both suggest that this policy will endure for some time. Have I summarized it correctly, or do you want to modify my understanding?
Well, absolutely. Well, Senator Merkley, well, you are absolutely right. I think the China now is sticking to this zero COVID in part because it's concerned about worst case scenario, right? If they open up, right, because of that immunity gap, that you're going to see rapid surge of cases nationwide. That is going to overwhelm the country's healthcare system. That is going to lead to mass die-off, an outcome that is not acceptable, right, to the Chinese leaders, in part because of these concerns about the social, political, right, the stability. But secondly, since President Xi himself is personally tied to zero COVID policy, right? Abandoning that policy, right, that would undermine his own personal stature, his even the political legitimacy. Uh, uh, also it has implications by when this issue of COVID response has been framed as a competition between two political systems, right? That abandoning the policy would be tantamount to admitting failure, right, in that competition.
Well, thank you very much. That's very helpful in understanding the situation. And I want to turn to Ms. Cook. And you talked about the information control system and how capable the Chinese government is controlling what people hear. And if I heard you right, you said one of the factors that is rather suppressed is the amount of food shortages in Xinjiang. I'm not even sure, but you may have said that starvation is a challenge in Xinjiang. Can you elaborate on that a bit? Our best understanding of how bad the shortage of food is.
Yes, I mean, this is really based on, I think, some reporting from Radio Free Asia, from reporting from groups like the Uyghur Human Rights Project, and I think from the bits that you see coming out, in terms of just reports of like just an inability to go out to get food. Exactly what the scale is very difficult to know, but I think just the example I gave of the fact that hundreds of people actually took to the streets in Xinjiang over food shortage and the kind of security environment reprisal they know they're going to face for doing that, I think can really speak to the desperation that people there are facing. And so I think that's, that's just one way that we have a sense. I mean, you see, tidbits of examples, reports, people tweeting, because there are so many people in the Uyghur diaspora community, a family there, who are saying if they are able to communicate, they're hearing how little food there is. Or there was, I'm not quite certain of what the current, again, status is. The bits of information that you kind of get out can sometimes come out with a lag. But that's one thing that I would say there. It did sound like, again, because there's so little room to try to negotiate with local officials, that some of those resources that people in other parts of China have been able to do in order to get some leniency from local officials is just much more absent in Xinjiang.
Thank you. If we have time for a second round of questions, I want to come back to several other things, including the use of content flooding that you discuss in your testimony to try to distract people from the challenges that are going on. And Dr. Truex, you noted that China has used their zero COVID as a cover for increasing surveillance and control, also to keep kind of foreigners out, including foreign scholars such as yourself, that you hadn't been able to go for 3 years. How has China handled the issue of returning Chinese students from overseas?
So I would say, those students are subject to sort of the same quarantine measures as all other international visitors. And up until a few days ago, that was about 10 days, and at some times during the pandemic, even longer than that. And so that alone has presented a significant barrier to people. International flights during much of the pandemic were also prohibitively expensive. So just from my own anecdotal experience, I would say the sort of flow back of our Chinese students back to their home country has been slowed significantly by zero COVID. But I wouldn't say that population has been necessarily singled out or treated any differently than any other type of visitor. So
are scholars able to go to China if they're willing to endure that 10-day quarantine?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So, and we're starting to see that more and more. I would say some academics are beginning to go back to China and conduct research. The research climate in China has significantly worsened in the last few years. It's getting more and more difficult to do the type of field work that gives us the deep understanding of the political and social dynamics there. But yes, that people are starting to go back. And there's sort of two levels of concerns. One is COVID and zero COVID quarantines, lockdowns. But there's also concerns about just sort of basic researcher security. The detention of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor did kind of cast a shadow over our community, and the willingness of the Chinese government to detain foreigners for political reasons was very worrisome to many people in our community. So I would say there's sort of two levels of concerns, and recent data by China File suggests that roughly 50% of foreign China scholars have pretty significant reservations about traveling to China, given both of those concerns at this stage.
Well, thank you. My time has expired. When we come back for a second round, if we have time, I'm going to ask you about, clarify about the measures announced last Friday that you had mentioned. And let me now turn to Congressman McGovern.
Thank you. You each speak to food shortages and inadequate medical care as a result of zero COVID restrictions. As a state party to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, China is obligated to protect the right to food and the right to health of its citizens. Dr. Huang, your testimony suggests that authorities have traded off the population's overall health status in order to achieve a low COVID infection rate. And each of you speak to the way the government promotes this as a success in propaganda narratives. So looking ahead from an analytical standpoint, how does the expert community measure China's policy in terms of health outcomes? Is there any way to engage objectively with China's scientific community? I open that up to anybody, or all of you.
Well, absolutely. I do believe that this actually highlighted the necessity for us to engage with the Chinese scientists, researchers, scholars, even the Chinese public health officials, having a dialogue, issues, public health, access, how they improve the social and economic rights, I think unfortunately has been a counter-halt, right, after 2018. And now I think it's time to resume that dialogue. And we could start from something, that is less politically sensitive, like issues like, conversation over non-communicable diseases, mental health, right? Those issues, then we could expand to other, maybe more sensitive issues, including human rights. This is not going to prevent, or discourage the United States from responding, effectively to challenges in other fields, but where you evince sincerity and commitment that the current overturn seems to be lacking, and giving China sort of a continued stake in the improvement of human rights in the country.
Dr. Truex or Ms. Cook, do you have anything you want to add?
I do not know.
All right. Dr. Huang and Truex, Dr. Truex, China's refusal to accept foreign-made vaccines and rely on less effective domestic ones has put China's citizens in an immunity gap with the rest of the world. To what extent is this driven by the leadership wanting to be seen as resisting foreign influence as a core message? I mean, are we seeing a case where that message is counterproductive?
I can offer an initial answer. I think there's a nationalism component here, of course, right? To admit that Chinese scientists failed to design a vaccine as effective as their Western and American counterparts would be tantamount to admitting some sort of inferiority in the scientific enterprise, which has been core to Xi Jinping and core to the CCP for the last 10 to 15 years. So I think a lot of it is just sort of nationalism and patriotism and a reluctance to accept. I think there's also a dynamic where, because the U.S. government has been very combative with Xi Jinping and with the CCP, there is certainly a little bit of bad blood, and perhaps that for that reason an unwillingness to ask for a helping hand.
Yeah, I would add that also that in addition to this technical nationalism, I think the zero COVID mentality also explain why China is reluctant to receive the U.S. the mRNA vaccines, because As we know, zero COVID, policy cannot tolerate any infections, right? But even the best vaccines, they cannot guarantee 100% protection, right? So, if like the mRNA vaccines, cannot protect 100% protection, and that makes the zero COVID policy more justifiable. Like those non-pharmaceutical measures, that they believe can shield the population, from the virus, and create a COVID-free society.
Dr. Truex, can you, did you want to add someone?
Yes, I was just going to add, and this relates to what Professor Truex was saying about the political campaign nature of this and some of the way in which disinformation internally in China has been a part. So back in March, there was actually a campaign on Weibo to amplify a certain hashtag that made it sound like Moderna had actually been made the coronavirus. And it got like 1.86 billion views. So you have those kinds of narratives in addition to all of the disinformation related to conspiracy theories surrounded Fort Detrick. That again adds to this difficulty of reversing course. Because if you've spread this, so I just wanted to mention that intersection as well.
Thank you. Dr. Truex, you recommend reestablishing people-to-people exchanges and funding research and international education programs centered in China. We heard similar recommendations from witnesses at our April hearing on minority languages and the September hearing on religious freedom. This makes sense to me, but how do we promote such people-based engagements without falling victim to a stigmatization that engaging with anything Chinese is somehow subversive?
I think this is about being realistic and valuing, just highlighting the value of people-to-people exchange. I think it's important for American national security to have Americans going to China, studying Chinese and learning about the country. And conversely, and this is perhaps more controversial to say, it is also in our interest to have Chinese citizens coming here, studying at our universities, perhaps assimilating and becoming part of our expert corps, as I believe Dr. Huang himself was formerly a Chinese citizen, is now our country's most renowned expert on COVID-19. So I would say we need to acknowledge the benefits of people-to-people exchange, and I know that's a difficult statement to make right now, given the security relationship, but I think it's critically important. And in terms of the Fulbright program, I mean, for me, these are easy wins for us. This is an important program. It's produced a lot of very important China experts over the years. And if we're looking for sort of ways to stabilize the U.S.-China relationship while still acknowledging strategic competition, these are sort of relatively straightforward measures that we can take that I think will be beneficial to both sides.
Thank you very much. I think I'm out of time. I yield back.
Thank you very much. And now we're going to turn to Congressman Hartzler. Congressman Hartzler, are you with us? If not, then I believe that Congressman Steele is up next.
Thank you so much, and thank you all the witnesses. The CCP's zero COVID policy has caused endless lockdowns and human rights violations. Hospitals refused patients who had serious medical needs, and citizens could not leave their own homes. Yet the CCP continues to claim their policies are successful. That's not what we're seeing this. So to all the witnesses, question one is the CCP has a long history of suppressing its own people. We have seen many raids, and we have been told the CCP is prohibiting religious gatherings. Is COVID being used to target posed threats by CCP? And how can we shed more light on these violations of basic human right?
Thank you, Congressman Steele, for the question. I think you're right. The evidence suggested that zero COVID measures have been used to facilitate the government suppression the nascent civil society. We have found that under the guise of breaking up illegal gatherings to prevent the spread of COVID, many religious venues are closed. Some of those groups now, including the government-sanctioned churches, are now, for example, allowed to reopen when zero COVID measures ease up. But most family churches continue to have difficulty holding worship services and prayer meetings. So I think in our future, the dialogues relationship with China, I think this should be paired with great and continued support for civil society building and good governance in the country.
So how are we going to let the whole world know that exactly what's going on? Because CCP is a very closed and it's very hard to know. That was the reason that I sent a letter out to actually the Olympic last year. During the Olympic, right before the Olympic, we sent out to all these big corporations that they sponsored the Olympics in Beijing that, just let's use your platform and just a little bit of that advertising money to let whole world know that what's going on in China. But it seems like it's not really working. So how can we do that? And then, just stop this violation of a basic human rights.
I would just say that, maybe this is a bit more optimistic, and it's so important to be putting pressure on American companies and others to do more. But in the recent research that my team did on Beijing's global media influence in 30 countries, one hand, we found the CCP is investing billions of dollars to get its propaganda all over the world. But we also found that there's a lot of resilience, especially in democratic societies, and especially in editors, in local media, in Peru, in Kenya, in Senegal, using news wires, especially from American news companies, but also say from BBC, to actually cover what's happening in Xinjiang, the protests in Hong Kong. And I think that's actually maybe seems like a small thing, but it really makes a difference. And when you look at public opinion sentiment, a lot of people around the world do see through some of the CCP propaganda. In the 30 countries we looked at, views of China and the Chinese government declined in 23 of them just in the last few years. So I actually feel like that's actually really different from just 5 or 10 years ago. I think there's a lot more that can be done to make sure that especially journalists in countries around the world have the resources, have the knowledge, have some of the language skills Rory talked about. Not only to report about what's happening in China, but the way in which corruption and things like that are happening in their own countries. But I actually it was a nice surprise to see that things are actually, the pushback also works, and it's really global. It's not just in the US or Australia. And I think that's one thing that I hope is helpful to keep in mind.
I really hope so too. And my second question is, we've been told that CCP is using COVID to increase their surveillance on its citizens now. We are moving from the gatherings to citizens. How concerned should we be about this, and how long-term ramifications could the citizens of China be under if the CCP continues this surveillance system? It seems like it's just amazing that they see who's moving to where to. Just cameras all over. So how are we going to do this?
I can offer an initial answer to that question, which I appreciate. I would say, one of the things that I'm most concerned about is this move towards a state that has what we might call perfect information on its own citizens. So not only information about their social networks, their spending, their online speech, their whereabouts, and now their health, and even DNA in some instances. And so it doesn't take a lot of imagination to understand why that's problematic in the hands of an authoritarian government. So I think we are headed in that direction of sort of an Orwellian panopticon, and I'm not someone who exaggerates a lot in this area, but I do think it's a very real concern. And the implication will be that political contention in China will become harder and harder for Chinese citizens. And so even protesting will become very difficult, let alone the sort of mass scale protest or revolution that could potentially spur political change. And so I think in some sense, we could say that the CCP is one of the most sophisticated repressive regimes in human history, and it will continue in that direction. You mentioned in your earlier question sort of what can be done. I think one of the most important things we can do as the US government or civil society, universities, is document what's happening, and document what's happening through Chinese voices, empowering Chinese voices of the dissident community, minority communities that have been oppressed. And we can't be irrationally optimistic that we will be able to change the direction of Chinese domestic politics. I think this really comes down to Xi Jinping and the people around him, and I'm not optimistic for the next 5 to 10 to 15 years. But at the very least, we can document what's going on, and I think that's important in and of itself.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, my time is up. I yield back.
Well, thank you very much, Congresswoman Steele. And I don't believe that Congressman Hartzler has joined us. And so if that's the case, I'm going to start a second round of questions. And if anyone arrived that I haven't seen, feel free to alert me. I want to start with this conversation about the question of advocating for journalists who have been imprisoned. And this issue is one where I'd like to get the kind of the Freedom House perspectives, since you're recommending that we do that. And if you could kind of share how effective is it for Americans to advocate for journalists who have been imprisoned. China, we worry sometimes that they may be kind of further mistreated for being associated with the West as we advocate for them, and or has it been effective? And I have this perspective that goes back to 2011 when a group of 10 senators went to China. Hu Jintao was general secretary, and the foreign journalists were saying, we have so much more freedom. We can now report on environmental issues. And one journalist told me about going to examine a new factory, and they were bragging about their environmental controls, but she went around to the back of it and found like the pipe with all the chemicals was just like sticking out there, putting all the chemicals directly into the river. But there wasn't, it was okay, like she could report on that. There was a lot of reporting on dyes in places where fabrics are developed doing damage to rivers. There was positive coverage of labor activists who were saying we need to improve the working conditions. And that all has changed with General Secretary Xi. And so just kind of your insights on the press and Xi's willingness to change how the press are treated, because I don't see that he has much willingness at all to change how the press are treated. And I'd love to hear a more positive interpretation.
I absolutely agree with you. I think in terms of the top-down evaluation, also in terms of conditions for foreign correspondence. I mean, some of the restrictions that Professor Truex mentioned about scholars, I mean, talking to people who are foreign correspondents in China, COVID-19 has also affected how much they're able to get out of Shanghai or Beijing or come back if they're able to get out there. I think with regards to people who are already in custody, especially further along in the kind of prosecutorial, process, honestly, in most cases, with the exception of places where, family members have preferred to keep it quiet, but in those cases, you wouldn't see the kind of attention and documentation that some of the cases that I've mentioned or that in the political prisoner database of the commission, you wouldn't see that kind of attention. And so in most cases, once someone's going through that process, the international attention tends to help. It helps because even if they're not, it used to be that they could get released. That's much rarer now in China. but it helps protect them. It helps them get medical care. It gets their family in to see them. It gets their lawyers in to see them. Sometimes it gets them out on medical parole. And it really can it can save people's lives even if it doesn't get them out. And I think the other thing I would say, in terms of one of the reasons we really emphasize this point of raising prisoners with counterparts at all levels. Because you could give a list to Xi Jinping and maybe that'll have effect, but less likely. But if you go to a provincial governor or a CCP party secretary who's coming to US for a trade deal, and you say, look, I know there are these 3 people who are in custody in this prison in your province, and I'd like to know, A, what their status is, because a lot of times we just don't know what it is, and 2, I'd like you to see if they can be released. Again, the local officials, they're dealing with all kinds of incentives, but a lot of times they may be more susceptible to the type of international pressure, and it can have more of a difference. So that would be one thing I would say.
Great. I always love to advocate for folks who want to make sure it has a positive impact. But the other part of the question, and I want to ask for more comment, is really any willingness to lighten the oppression of the press in China. And everything I'm hearing about information control suggests that not in the near future, at least. I did want to note or turn to you, Mr. Truex. I believe your recommendations encouraged foreign delegations to go. And do you have any sense of how many of the senators on this commission, the 8 senators on this commission, would actually be allowed to go to China and travel to various provinces that they might request to visit? Would we even be allowed into China?
I think that's an open question. I think you probably would. I've personally been involved in a delegation a few years ago through the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. And I think it's important to remember when one goes on a delegation like that you are seeing the part of China that the CCP wants you to see. So things can become very scripted. The interactions are very controlled. We shouldn't have delusions that we're going to have kind of free access to Xinjiang or Tibet or some of these other places. So I think that's important to acknowledge. But I would say even those kind of highly controlled situations, the sort of political theater around those interactions can be informative. And so as long as one goes in with the right lens and understanding the kind of what you're getting out of that type of exchange, I think it can still be valuable. And my sense would be, who knows, I think on the Chinese side, there probably would be some appetite to rebuilding some relationships. But that depends on sort of elite politics, and I'm not really party to that.
And you mentioned that there were measures announced last Friday related to the COVID. Can you bring us up to date on what those were and how that might change the course slightly?
Dr. Huang, could you do a better job of that than me, or do you want me to give it a try?
You go ahead.
Well, so basically 20 measures were announced this last Friday that amounted to a slight relaxation of some of the quarantine and lockdown practices. So for example, the time of quarantine once you enter into China has been reduced. I believe it's down to 4 or 5 days plus 3 days at home. They're also going to stop tracing contacts of contacts. So they're going to sort of pare down contact tracing in terms of exposures. Instead of doing second order exposures, they're just going to limit to first order exposures. So a slightly more pragmatic approach to COVID that is going to be rolled out throughout the country. But there was, in my sense, an overreaction to this, and people are interpreting that this is the end of zero COVID, and I would say this is a very small incremental step, and it shouldn't be overinterpreted. But Dr. Huang, I think you were the expert here.
Well, I agree, right? Because if you look at the PB and Popular Standing Committee meetings and the follow-up measures, right? The objective is to optimize zero COVID and not to abandon it. You also, right, it's important pointed out that the local level, the incentive structure has not been changed. The local government officials still asked to be held accountable, right, for COVID situation in their jurisdiction. So if anything bad happens, it's their responsibility. They're going to lose their posts, their jobs. But I also believe, right, that if we believe this, some real change happening, it may not come from the very top. It's very likely from the bottom up, when the local government officials, that have funding problems of sustaining the policy, and the local residents who are now so frustrated with the zero COVID, they might even collude, to push for some real change from the bottom.
Thank you for sharing that information. And the way you phrased it, optimizing zero COVID rather than ending it. We have been joined by Senator Ossoff, and the senator was on the Senate floor with baby Eva yesterday. I rushed over too late I'm told by a minute to see baby Eva, but congratulations on your healthy, beautiful little girl. And we'll turn it over to you, Senator Ossoff.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I'm sure that we can arrange a meeting between you and Eva at a time convenient for the baby. So we will get our schedulers working on that. But thank you for convening this hearing. Ms. Cook would like to ask you a few questions about the state of press freedom within China, and also the repressive tactics that the CCP uses to shape and control reporting external to China. Could you please characterize, Ms. Cook, how you've seen or what evolution you've seen in the state of press freedom, repression of reporting, and the external repression tactics during this COVID era, and if possible, as it relates to the CCP zero COVID policy?
Sure. I mean, press freedom in China was bad before COVID. There was very little space already under Xi Jinping over the past decade. Some of the opening you saw previously for investigative reporting. I think one thing we saw in the early days is that actually a lot of what we know about what happened in Wuhan now is because of reporting by not only citizen journalists, but some media outlets, professional outlets in China. But after censorship and other reprisals, that's pretty much been closed very much. And so the full apparatus that the Communist Party uses to not only suppress coverage, but guide, they call it kind of guiding and manipulate information to push certain content through the media ecosystem and online has just continued to be refined and advanced. One small tactic I'll mention is you just see more of the manipulation of the hashtags and the trending hashtags on major platforms like Weibo, and then kind of to really drive certain points related to COVID, related to the United States, to be honest, related to conspiracy theories, disinformation, whatever it is they want to push. And then you can see that there's kind of manipulation surrounding that, or other ways that we see leaked censorship directives that indicate that manipulation. So I think that's kind of one newer tactic that certainly affects what people can do. The other is the shuttering of WeChat accounts. People in China who actually need their WeChat account now to really survive and have their health code and things like that displayed, or other types of checks and information on their mobile phone in China, can get it shut down or suspended temporarily because they express views that the Chinese government doesn't like. And we're now seeing people write handwritten apologies to the Chinese company that runs the platform in order to try to get their accounts reinstated. So that's also one intersection in China. Outside of China, it's interesting because the CCP has really been on the defensive, not only because of what's happened with regards to COVID and the early cover-ups in Wuhan, but also what's happened in Hong Kong during this same period of time, the horrific atrocities happening in Xinjiang. And so they've been trying to be more aggressive on the propaganda side, but also in terms of trying to suppress local coverage. And this latest report we did that was published in September, we did case studies in 30 countries. We found in 24 evidence of some kind of censorship being applied to China-related coverage. In about half, it was coming from a Chinese official or a Chinese diplomat. But in 17 of the countries, it was actually coming through a local actor. So you would see a local government official trying to suppress news coverage related to China, a local media owner telling reporters not to report about something, either related to something happening in China or some kind of local, activities, investments, Huawei, or things like that. So I think that's where you see the intersection between the broader investment that the Communist Party has made in political influence globally, starting to translate into the domestic incentives that certain actors have to either support propagandizing CCP talking points or suppress certain types of coverage. So I would say that was one notable finding that we came out of that research.
Thank you, Ms. Cook. I'd like to ask you this second question and then turn to Mr. Huang as well on the same subject. In Tibet, in Xinjiang, we've seen some of the most restrictive, ostensibly COVID-related lockdowns in the past year. And of course, these regions are home to minority populations that already face massive repression and surveillance. How has this long-standing pattern and practice of surveillance and repression interacted with the new COVID regime to change conditions in those areas?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, with lockdowns elsewhere, you see these waves. So, there's certainly in terms of just the general reduced travel that you see within China from one region to another because of the zero COVID generally, you've seen reduced travel. When the lockdown comes, there is that additional intensification and securitization that is even more extreme than what you would see in other parts of China. And then I think that creates a situation in terms of also people being less inclined to dissent or to protest and gain concessions than what's possible in other parts of China. That bottom-up pressure creates even more severe conditions. So, for example, there was, one report that Radio Free Asia had about a single day in one region of Xinjiang and Gulja that has a long history of horrific suppression of the Uyghur community there, where there were 22 reported deaths unrelated to COVID, either because of other medical conditions or because of starvation. And that's just maybe one snippet of what we can know about what's happening. But you do see, as in other areas, that what's happening in the repression, restrictions, and the impact on people's lives in other parts of the country just become further amplified in these regions.
Thank you. Mr. Huang, I've got about 25 seconds remaining. Over to you on the same question, please.
So, absolutely. I think when we talk about the implementation of zero COVID in China, I personally, I don't think they're, targeting a particular ethnic minority when they implement the policy. I think about those draconian measures, right, that being more observed by some of those regions in China, more likely because the local governments are not so experienced in dealing with COVID, and the lack of state capacity also, right, that is basically drove them, to rely on this more heavy-handed measures, suppressing of the press freedom, so people's voice are not coming out from these regions when compared to cities like Shanghai or Guangdong.
Thank you so much, Mr. Huang, Ms. Cook, and Mr. Truex for your testimony. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Senator Ossoff. We're turning to Co-Chair McGovern, followed by we will turn next to our Secretary Peterson and then to the Congresswoman Steele. So, Co-Chair McGovern.
Well, thank you. Dr. Truex and Ms. Cook, the banners hung on the bridge in Beijing in late October made international headlines, and understandably so. It's not every day that you see traitor Xi Jinping displayed publicly in China. But how much can we reliably extrapolate from this? You testified to positive perceptions of the party's performance. How much space is there for citizens to push back against government policies that they don't like in ways that we cannot observe from here? Can zero COVID help us understand counter pressure within their system?
I can take an initial answer. I think it's a great question. And from our perspective, so I do a lot of work on public opinion data in China, and we should always be careful when we measure public opinion in China on surveys, because there's always a concern that Chinese citizens might be afraid to reveal how they really feel, even in a survey setting. So anything I say should be taken with that grain of salt. But nevertheless, the data does suggest that Chinese citizens in general express very, very high levels of support for the central government and much lower levels of support for the lower levels of government. So the central government, Xi Jinping, the Politburo Standing Committee, is viewed as sort of virtuous, and then sort of these incompetent, venal local governments. That's the general kind of narrative, I would say, from the public opinion data. People do feel comfortable expressing dissatisfaction, though, in different policy areas. So historically, the environment and corruption back in the Hu Jintao era were the number 1 and 2 issues for Chinese citizens. Inequality is also a major concern. But I would say that that dissatisfaction with specific policy areas doesn't necessarily mean that Chinese citizens seem to be voicing preferences for democracy or Western multi-party democracy. So again, there's nothing in the data that suggests that group in the population. They may well exist, but I tend to be of the belief that China's political education system, which teaches citizens to love the party and love the regime, is quite effective in the long term. That's not to say there isn't dissent, and I think the example you referenced, so-called Bridge Man, which came out a few weeks ago, is important. And so we never quite know the level of dissatisfaction in China. I think we can observe protests. It's telling. I believe there was a protest in Guangzhou a few days ago where people were overturning police cars. That's not something we see every day. So I think we can observe these visible protests. That gives us a hint as to where people are at. Also, the overseas population is important. So in response to the Bridge Man poster, even at Princeton University, many universities across the country and the world, there were similar protests and banners put up by the overseas Chinese students, which doesn't always happen. So my personal assessment would be, I think there is a waning support for zero COVID. It is exerting a kind of legitimacy cost for the regime. But I would also caution us in the sense that I do not think that this is something that necessarily threatens the regime in terms of regime change. There's a Western tendency to presume that the CCP is always on the brink of collapse, and we've been wrong on that for about 30 years now. So I think we need to be cautious with that interpretation. Thanks.
Ms. Cook, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just point to this new project actually some of my colleagues are working on called the China Dissent Monitor. And it's basically a database they've created of incidents of protest and dissent in China. And I think what they found really echoes what Professor Truex was saying, in that relatively few protests or acts of dissent target the central government. It's much more common for it to target the local government or companies. But they do get concessions. And so in the 40 examples that the data and the cases they collected just since June of protests in multiple different provinces related to zero COVID restrictions, people gained concessions in 9 of those. And those are mostly against local officials putting some kind of restriction on commuting, on movement, or some other kind of extreme measure that was causing serious hardship. And they ended up backing off actually after there was some kind of, usually it was on, real life protest. In some cases, it was more of an online protest. So I think that's partly what Chinese people are navigating at the grassroots level, where there can be serious reprisals and people get arrested, but there's also, it's not a completely lost cause if you're trying to get some kind of change or even accountability at some hospitals and things like that at the local level.
Thank you. Dr. Truex, you say that lockdowns continue to ebb and flow throughout the country. Can you give us a sense of where the decisions are being made? Are there decisions on which cities are locked down made by the central government, or are municipal officials making decisions per guidance from the center? And if the latter, to what extent does zero COVID reflect the maximalist dynamic that we see in implementation of policy in other areas? And I'm thinking of the strike hard campaigns in Tibet, Xinjiang, where local officials are incentivized to be as hard-lined as possible to please their superiors.
My understanding is that a lot of the major decisions for a given area are made by the local government. So for a given city, it would be by the municipal government, namely the party secretary and the mayor of that locality. Certainly in coordination with higher levels of government, but I do think there's a fair amount of they have a fair amount of leeway in what they do. But I think your point is astute in that this gives rise to kind of that performative dynamic that I was outlining earlier, in the sense that no official wants, certainly at the beginning of the COVID outbreak and even the last 6 months, no official wants to be seen as too light on COVID. And in fact, we observed the opposite. Li Qiang, who was the party secretary of Shanghai, who oversaw the debacle that was the Shanghai lockdowns, was rewarded and is now the #2 ranked leader in China. And so I think that's quite telling. My sense is moving forward, given where we're at with the economy and the kind of biological realities of COVID and the fact that it will likely overwhelm the system at some point, there might be some innovation at lower levels of government to try to implement these sort of slightly more relaxed measures. They are balancing COVID versus social stability in the economy, and these lower level officials are trying to maximize across these multiple dimensions. And driving COVID down to zero might not always be the most productive avenue moving forward. So I think moving forward, my guess is that we're going to see some experimentation at lower levels of government, but to date it has been a lot of that kind of maximalist performative governance that you allude to. Yes.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair McGovern. And we are now turning to Secretary Peterson.
Thanks very much. Just a quick follow-up on protest actions among the diaspora. Have you seen evidence of reprisals against the people in the diaspora when they undertake these actions?
I personally have not to date. I think a lot of these actions are very anonymized. So what I'm observing on campuses across the country and the world is the placement of posters. And so those are usually done in the cover of night and they're done anonymously. So we aren't observing, at least I haven't seen much in the way of kind of mass protests by Chinese students or citizens against Xi Jinping or against zero COVID, which would lead to more direct reprisals. So I think it's the nature there. In our field, we talk about the repertoire of contention. So the way people protest and the way they voice their discontent is a function of the repressive environment. So I think overseas Chinese citizens are quite astute, and they know that this is the way to sort of make their voice heard and known in a relatively safe way.
Thank you very much. I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you very much. Congresswoman Steele, who was with us, but I think may have just left. Oh, there we are. Representative Steele, are you still with us? Okay, if not, we're going to wrap up. And I really appreciate very much each of your expertise. Dr. Huang from the Council of Foreign Relations, Ms. Cook from Freedom House, Dr. Truex from Princeton University. You've really helped to inform the dialogue in America about the conditions of the zero COVID policy and very many related pieces of the puzzle. And we appreciate it. The record will remain open until the close of business on Friday, November 18th, for any items members would like to submit for the record or additional questions for our witnesses. And with that, our hearing is adjourned.